So, this is a huge topic. Any one of those family names would be enough for a program alone, and more. So, obviously, I'm just going to skim some of the better known people, and also some of the people that we know more about in this particular program. As far as illustrations go, when I could find a portrait of someone, I've incorporated that. Unfortunately, a lot of people just have gravestones to represent them. But thank goodness we at least have that much. So, some of the images are a little scant, but that's what I was trying to update because I had gotten some more portraits and wanted to put them in, and then the power went out. So I've been catching up ever since. All right, William Alston, also known as William Alston Jr. and by the nickname Gentleman Billy, he's a double L Alston, was among the first of his family to live in the region that became known as Georgetown County. He was the fourth son of John Alston and Sarah Blaine. His father received King's grants in the region and then purchased the Brookgreen land around 1740, although he continued to live in Charleston. William Jr. acquired Brookgreen in 1765, which is later than we had always thought that he got the property. And he developed it as his primary home. And it's thought that the original Brookgreen plantation house was built by him at the time he acquired the property. And that is the only photograph we have of that house, taken just before it burned in 1901. Wow. So things were pretty bleak here at Brookgreen in those days. William Alston was fond of horse racing, having won a race with his chestnut horse trial in 1769. His descendant Susan Alston, in her book Brookgreen Walk-a-Maw, described the bowl, which you see there on the left. The etching in the old white silver of a racehorse in full action is entrancing. This bowl was made to order in London by Abraham Portal, as proved by the silver mark. It was sent in the early 20th century to the Smithsonian in Washington in a loan exhibit, and was pronounced by Dr. Marcus Benjamin to be the finest piece of Paul Revere's work he had ever seen. That would lend color to the probability that though there were a number of silversmiths in Charleston at that time, the bowl was sent to Boston to be marked, and the beautiful etching was done there. So while the bowl may have been made in London, it was engraved or etched by Paul Revere, according to Marcus Benjamin anyway, who was supposed to know about these things. Miss Alston also cited that this was a possible reason why the date on the bowl was 1768, and the date of the newspaper reporting the race was 1769. And the flatware set on the right belonged to William Alston. And we had a knife and fork here at Brookgreen on display in the old kitchen for many years. I don't know if you all remember when there was a history exhibit in the old kitchen years and years ago. And apparently the display case was not as good as it might have been, and someone stole that fork and knife. We no longer have it. On January 9, 1775, William Alston married his second wife, Rachel Moore, from a fine Charleston family. Rachel had been pressured into the marriage by her father, a wealthy aristocrat and a staunch patriot. And William and Rachel had 5 more children, Mary, Washington, and William, who lived to adulthood, and a son and a daughter who died in infancy. In the book, The Life of Marion, Alston was described as a firm patriot and good soldier. He may well be enumerated among the martyrs to the cause of his country, for having been seized with a fever in camp, he expired at a middle age. And his death date is unclear. Inscribed on the gravestone in the cemetery at Turkey Hill is July 31st, 1780, aged 42 years. It's very clear, although you probably can't see it clearly in that picture. Whereas all other written accounts list 1781 as the year of his death. The family story relates that William became ill at the Battle of Cowpens in the northwestern part of the state, rode hard to Brookgreen and collapsed and died a few days later. The battle took place January 17th, 1781. And we know he was there at Cowpens. So obviously he didn't die in 1780. So whoever gave the information to have that stone carved made a mistake, which is why you must never go by dates on stones in cemeteries if you're doing genealogy. At the time of his marriage to Rachel, he had 2 children, Benjamin and Elizabeth, from his first marriage. And Benjamin is also buried at Turkey Hill. And Turkey Hill Cemetery today is considered the Double L Alston Cemetery. It's part of the reserve development next to Willbrook. And then the Oak Cemetery here on Brookgreen's property is considered the single L Alston Cemetery. Brookgreen Plantation had been left by William Alston to his eldest son, Benjamin, but Benjamin lost the plantation by pledging security for a friend who did not fulfill his promise.
Oh, no.
When his lawyer told him that he was not of age when the note was signed and therefore not legally responsible, according to a family story, he replied, "I was old enough to know what I was doing." So Brookgreen passed from the hands of the Alston family at that point. That would have been around 1799, 1800. Washington Alston was an American painter, writer, and poet born to William and Rachel Moore Alston at Brookgreen in 1779. Alston pioneered America's romantic movement of landscape painting. He was well known during his lifetime for his experiments with dramatic subject matter and his bold use of light and atmospheric color. Alston's mother, Rachel, had married Captain William Alston in 1775, and he died in 1781. Rachel Alston's second husband, Dr. Henry Collins Flagg, was the son of Ebenezer Flagg, a wealthy shipping merchant from Newport, Rhode Island. Henry became a father to young Washington, who was a child at the time of the marriage. Named in honor of George Washington, Washington Alston graduated from Harvard in 1800 and moved to Charleston for a short time before sailing to England in May of 1801. He had inherited Springfield Plantation from his father, but sold it to finance his art studies abroad. He was admitted to the Royal Academy in London in September when painter Benjamin West was president. From 1803 to 1808, Alston visited the great museums of Paris and then spent several years in Italy, where he met writers Washington Irving and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who became his lifelong friends. In 1809, Alston married Anne Channing, sister of William Ellery Channing, the Unitarian theologian. Samuel F.B. Morse, who was a painter as well as inventor of the Morse code, was one of Alston's art pupils and accompanied Alston to Europe in 1811. After traveling throughout Western Europe, Alston finally settled in London, where he won prizes and fame for his paintings. Alston was also a published writer. In London in 1813, he published The Sylphs of the Season with other poems, which was republished in Boston later that year. His wife died in February 1815, leaving him lonely and homesick for America. In 1818, he returned to the United States and lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 25 years. He was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1826. In 1841, he published Monaldi, a romance illustrating Italian life, and in 1850, a volume of his lectures on art and poems. Washington Alston first used the term objective correlative, around 1840 in the introductory discourse of his Lectures on Art to suggest the relation between the mind and the external world. It was popularized later by writer and poet T.S. Eliot, who in his essay Hamlet and His Problems described it as a situation or a chain of events that acts as a formula and is used in art to evoke emotion. Alston was sometimes called the American Titian because his style resembled the great Venetian Renaissance artists in their display of dramatic color contrasts. His work greatly influenced the development of American landscape painting and was a forerunner of the movement known as the Hudson River School. The themes of many of his paintings were drawn from literature, especially biblical stories. Alston was held in the highest esteem in 19th century Boston, where his work appealed especially to literary figures and intellectuals. His artistic genius was much admired by his friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Ralph Waldo Emerson was strongly influenced by his paintings and poems, as well as feminist Margaret Fuller and writer Sophia Peabody, who was the wife of Nathaniel Hawthorne. The influential critic and editor Rufus Wilmot Griswold dedicated his anthology, The Poets and Poetry of America, to Alston in 1842. Poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, 17 years after Alston's death, wrote, "One man may sweeten the whole time. I never passed through Cambridge Port without thinking of Alston. His memory is the quince in the drawer and perfumes the atmosphere." The West Boston, Massachusetts neighborhood of Alston is named for him. When plans to establish an art museum in Boston evolved after the Civil War, Alice Hooper wrote to one of the museum founders, Martin Brimmer, "We thought we couldn't better testify our interest in this new art movement at home than by adding a really fine Alston to our public collection." She went on to suggest that the museum be named after Alston, whom she referred to as the one great artist of America. But instead, the museum became known as the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Alston's painting, Elijah in the Desert, donated by Alice Hooper and her mother, was the very first object to enter the collection in 1870, even before the museum had a building. And I think the Museum of Fine Arts has the greatest collection of Washington Alston's paintings, certainly the greatest quantity of them. Boston painter William Morris Hunt was an admirer of Alston's work, and in 1866 founded the Alston Club in Boston, and in his art classes passed on to his students his knowledge of Alston's techniques. Washington Alston died in 1843 at age 63. He's buried in Harvard Square in the old burying ground between the First Parish Church and Christ Church, and that's his grave. Born in 1801 to Benjamin, the elder son of William Alston, Robert Francis Withers Alston attended prep school in West Point Military Academy, from which he graduated in 1821. He served in the U.S. Army until he resigned his commission in 1823 to engage in rice and indigo cultivation on his plantation on the Petey River. Alston was one of the most successful planters in South Carolina and eventually owned a 1,500-acre plantation after reclaiming lands underwater by a system of canals and embankments. He married Adele Pettigrew from a prominent Huguenot family, and they're both shown here. From 1828 until 1833, Alston served in the State House of Representatives and then in the Senate. During the nullification crisis in 1832 and 33, he was an advocate of the states' rights point of view. From 1850 until his election as governor in 1856, Alston served as president pro tem of the Senate. As governor, Alston was concerned with improving the public education system of South Carolina. He attempted to gain greater state and local tax support for the schools. During his time as governor, he owned the Nathaniel Russell House in Charleston and made that as his primary residence. Of course, many of you have probably been there. Alston died in 1864 at Shakora Wood, his plantation near Georgetown. The first of the Flagg family in South Carolina was Dr. Henry Collins Flagg of Newport, Rhode Island. The son of Ebenezer and Mary Ward Flagg, he was from a prominent and wealthy family of merchants and shippers. During the American Revolution, Flagg came to South Carolina as chief surgeon on the staff of General Nathaniel Greene of the Continental Army. He met and became friends with William Alston of Brookgreen Plantation, who invited the doctor to visit his home on the Waccamaw River. Alston died in 1781 before Dr. Flagg made the visit. His widow, Rachel, and her children received not only Flagg's condolences, but his friendship, and soon a romance blossomed between the widow and the doctor. Supposedly, Rachel said, "I married first to please my family. I marry second to please myself." Henry Collins Flagg and Rachel Moore Alston were married in 1784 and lived at Brookgreen until early 1800, when it was sold to Joshua Ward. Dr. Flagg was known for the fatherly support given to his stepson, Washington Alston. This encouragement came at a time when the child might not have been allowed to pursue a career in arts and letters. Henry and Rachel also entertained George Washington at Brookgreen in 1791. Washington spent one night under their roof, then went on to Clifton Plantation, owned by William Alston, the single L. Alston, his cousin, where they had breakfast. The Flaggs had 3 children. Mary, who married her cousin William Algernon Alston of the single L. Alstons. Henry Collins Flagg, Jr., who returned to New England and established a new branch of the family in the Northeast. And James Montgomery Flagg, the illustrator, Uncle Sam, I Want You. And Ernest Flagg, an architect. The Singer Building in New York is one of his best-known buildings, are descended from that family. And then the third son was Ebenezer, who became a doctor, married Margaret Elizabeth Blaine, and established the South Carolina branch of the family. Henry Collins Flagg died in Charleston, April 1st, 1801, and was buried at the Brick Church in St. Thomas and St. Denis Parish. His obituary in the South Carolina Gazette stated in part, "Died on Wednesday last at the age of 55 years, Henry Collins Flagg, an eminent physician and inhabitant of this city and a member of the Cincinnati. A native of Rhode Island, but had long resided in this state and had acquired the friendship and esteem of a large circle of respectable citizens. In the late contest with Great Britain, he took an active and decided part with his countrymen and accepted the appointment as surgeon to the 1st South Carolina Continental Regiment, in which capacity he continued until the close of the war." I don't have a portrait of Ebenezer Flagg, but this is his wife, Margaret. He graduated from the South Carolina Medical College at Charleston in 1832 and was a member of the Winyah Indigo Society in Georgetown. His wife, Margaret Blaine, was the sister of Reverend James L. Blaine, who lived at Cedar Hill in Murrells Inlet, now the site of Blaine Methodist Church, and owned a large amount of land in the area. Of their 8 children, 4 lived to maturity, and 1 might still be with us. The legend surrounding Alice Blaine Flagg is an oft-repeated part of Waccamaw Neck lore. While the story of her illness and death due to malaria at the age of 15 is probably accurate, she was not buried in the well-visited grave at All Saints Episcopal Church. According to the parish register, she was buried in a small family cemetery on her uncle's property at Cedar Hill and Murrells Inlet, and her grave is not marked. Today it is part of the property of Blaine Methodist Church. And her short life has become the subject of one of the most popular ghost stories in this region. Most likely, the grave at All Saints, its stone carved with the single name Alice, was intended for her namesake, the daughter of her brother, Dr. Allard Flagg, in whose family plot it is placed. But the grave was not used because the second Alice was buried at Prince Frederick's Church near her final home in Plantersville. And after all these years, it's still a tantalizing mystery, and of course, many people visit the grave and leave tokens there. Alice's brothers, Allard and Arthur, married two sisters, Penelope and Georgiana, daughters of Joshua John Ward of Brookgreen Plantation. Upon his marriage in 1850 to Penelope, Allard received property from his uncle, the Reverend Blaine, and became the owner of Wachesaw Plantation on the Waccamaw, Oak Lawn on Sandy Island, and a summer place on the creek at Murrells Inlet known as the Hermitage. He graduated from the South Carolina Medical College in 1845, specializing in the study of bilious remittent fever. But he also grew rice at Wachesaw and was a member of the Hot and Hot Fish Club. Allard and Penelope had 4 children, but only 2 survived childhood. Alice Blaine Flagg, named for her father's sister, lived with her brother, Allard Jr., on family property in Plantersville. The brother and sister never married and continued to care for their father after their mother's early death. In 1867, after a redivision of the estate of their grandfather, Joshua John Ward of Brookgreen, they received a portion of Springfield Plantation, known as the Farm, with a house and outbuildings and 157 acres of rice fields. Today, Springfield is located within Brookgreen Gardens property on the north edge of the Lowcountry Zoo and is traveled across on the Trekker Tour to Laurel Hill. Alice and her father survived the hurricane of October 13, 1893, at the Hermitage, while Allard Jr. was lucky to escape from his cottage at Magnolia Beach by jumping onto the floating roof of his kitchen, which was carried by the current to the mainland. He was lucky. The tragedy of this storm touched nearly all of the families in Georgetown County, but probably none were as hard hit as the family of Arthur and Georgiana Flagg. This storm was also known as the Flagg Flood because nearly everyone in that family lost their lives. Arthur Blaine Flagg had graduated from the South Carolina Medical College in 1850, maintained an active practice on the Waccamaw Neck, and also donated his medical services at the Waccamaw Mission, begun in 1887 at Brookgreen Plantation by Dr. and Mrs. Lewis Hazel and Mrs. Marinus Willett. Arthur and Georgiana Flagg lived on a part of the Brookgreen property known as Spring Hill, which was her inheritance from her father. They also received 360 acres of rice land and the privilege of using the Brookgreen barnyard and entrance avenue in perpetuity. Spring Hill is the undeveloped area on the south side of the sculpture garden adjacent to Pegasus and the Fountain of the Muses. In fact, Pegasus and the Fountain of the Muses are located in what was the pasture for Spring Hill. The Flaggs had 3 sons and 1 daughter, Arthur Blaine Flagg Jr., Joshua John Ward Flagg, Charles Edward Blaine Flagg, and Georgiana Flagg. And Arthur and Georgiana, the mother and father, are buried in All Saints Cemetery. Joshua John Ward Flagg received his medical degree from the South Carolina Medical College in 1881 and set up practice with his father. He never married and devoted his time to treating the people of the Waccamaw Neck and Sandy Island at his office and at the Waccamaw Mission. He was 33 years old when the hurricane struck Magnolia Beach, and he watched his mother, father, 2 cousins, and house servants as they were swept away by waves that he later estimated to have been 40 feet high. Wow. I don't know about that, but it was obviously a horrible storm. Another cousin, Ann Weston, was saved along with him by clinging to the top branches of a tree, of a tree next to the house. After the storm, when rescuers came, their fingers had to be pried loose from the branches because they'd held on so tightly for several hours. After the trauma of identifying the bodies of his family and friends, it's said that he never returned to the ocean, although he lived within its reach for the rest of his life. He was living at Spring Hill when the property was purchased by Archer and Anna Huntington in 1930, and he served as postmaster at the Brookgreen Post Office until his death in 1938. His brother, Arthur Flagg Jr., married Martha Ann LaBruce in 1881. Arthur was the first South Carolina Flagg who did not study medicine. His occupation is not certain, but it appears that he operated a store at Brookgreen or at Spring Hill. Everyone in this family perished in the storm of 1893, except for the eldest daughter, Margaret Elizabeth, who was away at school at the time. The family names of Arthur Flagg Jr. are memorialized on one marker in the cemetery of All Saints Church. Most of their bodies were never found. It's a sad commentary of the day when the Atlantic Ocean and the Waccamaw River shook hands, as remembered by residents of the Gullah community on the Waccamaw Neck. Margaret Elizabeth, or Madge as she was known, was raised by her father's sister, Georgiana, who was in nurses training in Philadelphia at the time of the storm. Madge also became a nurse, and together they survived the San Francisco earthquake and fire in 1906. Colonel William Alston was a member of Francis Marion's brigade during the American Revolution. He's a single L. Alston. And he participated in the defense of Georgetown. Known as King Billy, he dropped the second L from his last name to distinguish his family from that of his cousin, William Alston of Brookgreen. His father, Joseph Alston, known as Joseph of the Oaks, left him Clifton Plantation on the Waccamaw Neck. William's brother Thomas received Prospect Hill Plantation and built such a beautiful house there that William built a duplicate of it at Clifton. The Clifton house burned in the early 19th century. However, its image lives on in Prospect Hill, which today is the house at the property known as Arcadia Plantation on the south end of the Waccamaw Neck. So I've shown you 3 homes of William Alston. He owned the house that's known historically as the Miles Bruton House in Charleston, which was brought to him by his second wife, Mary Bruton Mott. And then he also owned several plantations, but after Clifton burned, he lived at Fairfield Plantation on the Waccamaw Neck. And then this is a photograph of Prospect Hill taken around 1893 to show you what Clifton would have looked like, and it probably would have looked as dilapidated as Prospect Hill did. Times were hard then, for sure. I think some of you may have visited Arcadia during the Prince George Winyah Episcopal Church tours each spring to see how it's been added onto. The wings on each side of the house were not original and are actually early 20th century additions, but the central portion of the house remains the same. William was a respected breeder of horses and a planter in the Georgetown region, and when George Washington came to South Carolina in 1791, after he spent the night at Brookgreen with Henry and Rachel Flagg, Washington had breakfast at William Alston's Clifton Plantation. As a member of the South Carolina Senate, Alston supported Thomas Jefferson's programs. The portrait of him as a young man that I showed you at the beginning, there on the left, is by Thomas Sully, but it was copied in 1846 from an original done by Samuel F.B. Morse, portrait or the student of Washington Alston, who became a great painter. And that painting was done in 1818. The portrait of him as an older man is by Charles Frazier. William Alston was married twice. His first wife, Mary Ashe, gave him 4 children. And the eldest was Joseph Alston, who attended what is now Princeton University and graduated college before he turned 17. He studied law in the office of Edward Rutledge, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and was admitted to the bar by 1799. His family was wealthy, and he was wealthy in his own right from the inheritance of his grandfather, Joseph, who left him the Oaks Plantation here on the Waccamaw Neck when he was 5 years old. At the encouragement of his father, he made his appearances in northern social circles, and in New York met his future wife, Theodosia Burr, the daughter of Aaron Burr. Burr recognized the promise in Alston, as well as entertained the possibility of how Alston's wealth and influence could help him in his quest for the presidency. Joseph married Theodosia in 1801 in Albany, New York. He entered politics in South Carolina in 1802 when he was elected to the legislature, and served there until December 10, 1812, when he was elected governor. The story of Joseph and Theodosia is one of great love and tragedy. The young couple began happy and prosperous. Joseph's political star was on the rise, pushed by his father and father-in-law. Theodosia was learning to like South Carolina, although it was quite a change from her native New York. But things turned sour, as she never fit in as a highly educated and accomplished woman in a time when most women did not have those opportunities. Then Aaron Burr was charged with killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel in 1804, and later with treason in a plan to colonize the lands west of the Mississippi River and create a new country. There were questions as to whether Joseph and Theodosia were involved in the plan, but they were never charged. After Burr's acquittal, he went to France in self-imposed exile for 4 years, and Theodosia, who was very close to her father, suffered in his absence. In 1802, she had given birth to their only child, Aaron Burr Alston, giving new hope to the Alston family. But the boy died of malaria in June 1812 at the age of 10. Theodosia, who had never recovered physically from his birth, weakened further and suffered from depression. When her father returned to New York, she begged to be able to visit him. And this was during the War of 1812, and Joseph was concerned about having her travel. A trip overland was out of the question due to her physical condition, so it was decided that she would go by ship. All of the usual sailing vessels had been seized by the Navy. He eventually found the Patriot on which she would travel. The Patriot left Georgetown Harbor on December 30th, 1812, and was never seen again. There are many stories of the fate of the ship and its passengers, some fanciful, involving pirates, but most historians agree that the ship went down in a storm in early January off the coast of North Carolina. Joseph wrote to Aaron Burr in February 1813, "This then is the end of all the hopes we had formed. Oh, my friend, if there be such a thing as the sublime of misery, it is for us that it has been reserved." Joseph died in 1816 at the age of 37 and was buried at the Oaks in the Alston family cemetery with other members of his family, including his son. His epitaph reads in part, "The loss of this citizen was no common one to the state. To its service he devoted himself from his early years. On the floors of its legislature he was distinguished for his extensive information and his transcendent eloquence. In the chair of the House of Representatives for his impartial, correct decisions, and everywhere he was distinguished for his zealous attachment to Republican principles. In the capacity of Chief Magistrate of the state, both the honor and responsibility of the trust were heightened by the difficulties and dangers of the War of 1812. He, by his indomitable activity and his salutary measures, earned new titles to the respect and the gratitude of his fellow citizens. This great man was also a good one. He met death with that fortitude with which his ancestor did, from whom he received his name in this estate, and which is to be found only in the good, hoping to rejoin those whose loss had left his heart an aching void that nothing on earth could fill." And that's only part of the epitaph. It's amazing. Other sons of William Alston were John Ashe Alston of Hagley Plantation, William Algernon Alston of Rose Hill Plantation, Charles Alston of Fairfield Plantation, and Thomas Pinckney Alston of Weehawken and True Blue Plantations. They all distinguished themselves in various ways as rice planters, as lawyers. They also served, I think all of them served at one time in the South Carolina legislature. And these, while many of their properties live on in the names of housing developments today, the Alston family, Alston family, was quite interesting. And really, aside from the family of Joshua John Ward, were the primary landowners in Georgetown County in the 18th and 19th centuries. Thank you.
Oh.